regardless of your political stance, there is a climate today, and I believe it's a very positive or a mostly positive climate today, where people are beginning to make reparations for uh, slavery that was institutionalized and really just kind of put into the framework of the building of most of the nations of the world. And here in the States, in the United States where I live, people are really beginning to give a lot of thoughts and put a lot of actions toward ending that systemic racism, or at least identifying it, and really giving a hard look at it, and having excuse me, many conversations about systemic racism and the effects that they had, that slavery had here in America for hundreds of years. And in light of the current climate, sometimes people misunderstand in the BDSM sense when we begin to talk about slavery. And so I wanted to talk today, Primal Piggy here on this BDSM United podcast. Today we want to kind of tackle the question, is consensual slavery ethical? And how does consensual slavery, the type that we practice within BDSM, how does it differ from the type of slavery that America and Europe and some other countries of the world, or many other countries of the world, have experienced in both the past and ongoing slavery that happens? What are some examples of the ongoing slavery that exists today? Well, there's like I can think of like four different types here of modern slavery that we see today. A big problem, and this is why we this first one, human trafficking. This is one of the big ones of why we really stress that people should thoroughly vet potential play partners. They shouldn't put themselves in relationship in sorry, they shouldn't put themselves in situations that are not safe. They should vet. They should use safe calls. They should first meet at places like BDSM munches, in public places. They should not uh, allow a new potential partner to isolate them or insulate them from their friends and their family, um, because human trafficking, a lot of times people will uh, have the potential to meet a partner who is somewhat catfishing them, who is saying that they're a dominant partner and they want to be in whatever type of relationship the person's looking for, and they will, go to meet the person, and they will oftentimes get raped, and they will get uh, confined and imprisoned, so to speak, and then be trafficked. And so maybe be passed among. There's been instances where people have thought they were meeting one person, and there would be turn out to be 5 or 10 people in the room, and so it was, which is a human trafficking type of situation. And so where someone has paid to to have sex with someone that another person is bringing in. Human trafficking is a process of bringing a person into a situation of exploitation through a series of actions, including deceptive recruitment and coercion. Sometimes getting a person hooked on drugs or alcohol, or really pressing them with guilt and shame, raping them, and then using the shame of that rape to continue to rape them. And so, human trafficking is definitely bad, and it is not a part of BDSM at all. None of these four are. Forced labor. That's any work or services which people are not doing voluntarily, and which is exacted under a threat of some form of punishment. Sometimes people will get that put in situations where someone says they're looking for a service submissive and end up getting locked away and under threat of their life, or someone killing their family or doing harm to their family, will uh, turn a service submissive type of with what somebody thinks is going to be that will actually be trying to get forced labor out of them. And bonded labor, this is a big one today, and outside of BDSM, especially here. This one doesn't really too much apply to us here, but it's labor that is demanded as a means of repayment of a debt or a loan. Oftentimes it is a loan that can never be repaid. Someone will give the person housing and food and take care of their needs, and put them in a situation where they are there to pay off a debt, but they will rack up even more debt because they will charge them for rent and food and all those sort of things, and they just have to keep working and working and working to pay off a debt or a loan that they can never repay. It's a really common, especially in other countries, where someone gets in debt and they take somebody who's in debt and give them the hope, or at least at first give them the hope of repaying a debt or a loan, but then they tack on even more debt, a debt that they can never repay, and so they get forced and free labor out of that situation, which is a form of unethical slavery, as is forced labor and human trafficking. And then slavery in general is a situation where a person exercises perceived power of ownership over another person. And we'll talk today mainly about that type of slavery that existed in the past and somewhat exists in still today. And we'll look at that non-consensual, unethical slavery, and then I'll show you some ways that slavery within BDSM is both ethical and good for the persons involved. And so, let's first look at some definitions. Let's define the two different identities of people that are commonly get into slavery, or are in on the S type slash of to the right side of either a dominant and submissive relationship or a master slave relationship or mistress slave. And we're going to look at both the submissive and the slave. We're going to show some of the unique characteristics of what make these identities within BDSM both consensual and what make them ethical. So submissive is a person who chooses at certain times and within certain conditions to submit to the will of their partner. The conditions typically include terms of service, length of service, areas of the submissive's life the dominant does not get to control, the hard and soft limits, when they play or just interact, and the safe words they'll use when scening. Although it is counterintuitive, the submissive has some degree of control over an SM play scene through safe words, at least until they enter subspace. That's kind of a big, broad term here. I'm using a definition by Dr. Robert Ruppel, and he has a really good definition here. So let's look at this real fast, this paragraph that I just read. It's really a submissive, first and foremost, is a person who chooses. When you are in a submissive type relationship, you have a choice. And then it says at certain times and within certain conditions, they choose to submit to the will of their partner. The mark of a power exchange relationship, which is what a dom sub relationship is within BDSM, is that you choose at certain times. It's a limited It's a limited submission. It's a limited power exchange. It's a partial power exchange. It's not. It's not. It doesn't totally encompass all of your life. You choose certain times within certain conditions, and these things are negotiated. And oftentimes they are drawn up in a contract. And a contract is just, and negotiations are just discussions, and a contract is just agreements. And so they may be formal, they may be written down for both persons to be able to reference, or they may be informal, they may be just verbal agreements. And so the really important thing here is that uh, submitting to the will of their partner. The important thing to note here is that the partner, uh, they should really know their partner well, or be getting to know their partner well. That's the process we call vetting. That's where we look for inconsistencies. It's where a potential partner, they tell us things about themselves, and we investigate both their past and check their references, and begin to maybe play or be around them in public and in places where we can look for inconsistencies, which would be red flags. Uh, and then red flags don't always mean to run or go the other way. They just, sometimes you need to seek some further clarity and see these are some inconsistencies I see between what you're telling me and who you appear to actually be. And I need some clarity on those issues before we continue. And during that consideration, that time of consideration and vetting, before you submit to the will of your partner, of this potential partner, you really kind of check them out. You want to be sure that they are somebody who is worthy of earning your trust. And so you don't just submit to the will of just any partner, or any certain person. This isn't just for a scene. This is for a relationship. But within BDSM, relationships are oftentimes more so than vanilla relationships. They include things, a certain heightened level of risk, because we're playing with like rough sex or S&M and different things like that. And so part of being involved in BDSM is being risk aware, and knowing the risks, and trying our best to do this whole BDSM thing safely. And so under certain conditions, we submit to the will of our partner if we're a submissive. And the conditions include terms of service, length of service, and then areas of the submissive's life that the dominant doesn't get to control. Oftentimes, it's involved with their family, or their work, or their religion, things like that, things that are off the table. Within regular slavery, people don't get to choose. They don't. It's not at certain times that they choose, or certain conditions that they choose. It's something that is forced upon them, and it does not include terms of service and length of service. It doesn't generally include a contract. It doesn't include negotiations. It doesn't. And there are no areas of the person's life that that the slaveholder doesn't control. There are no hard or soft limits when they play or just interact, and there are no safe words. There's no ending the slavery. There's no getting out of it when it's an unethical type of modern slavery. And so a submissive is totally different and totally ethical, because it's consensual. The person chooses. There's limits. There's safe words. There's ways to, they can choose at any time to stop, and they can choose at any time to leave. And so, and within the scene, of course, they have, like I said, some control over the scene through safe words. And it says at least until they enter subspace. Subspace is kind of like a trance-like state where chemicals are released in our body. And this is also really important why you would vet a potential partner, because they have to really care for you. It should really be a relationship. A power exchange is ultimately a relationship, and the person should uh, have a certain love and care and respect for you, because when you enter subspace, you may not be able to speak, or and things like that, because like I said, it is somewhat of where your own body releases chemicals that put you in almost like a drug like state. It's endorphins and all these different bodily chemicals. And so sometimes during play, especially S&M play, uh, people have been known to go into this, have like spiritual type experiences and have physical experiences, almost like a drug. And so almost like being drugged, but it's your own body doing it. So DS relationships are based on power exchange. This means that a submissive, a person who normally has as much or as little personal control as society gives them, they surrender some of that personal control to a dominant for a prescribed period in exchange for specific benefits negotiated from the dominant type. Submissives have a strong desire to serve, but that service is limited to just their dominant and is offered within negotiated conditions. Submissives, unlike slaves, a slave may be sold to another person, or their body may be given to another person against their will, unconsensually. Submissives, they have a strong desire to serve, but that service is limited to just their dominant partner or dominant partners if they happen to be polyamorous. Typically, the negotiated area includes the submissive's terms of service, the length of service, the hard, soft limits, the safe words, as we said. The submissive will also negotiate things, like I said, like family and children, work, education, religious observance, things that those are aspects off commonly that the Dom doesn't control. Conditions under which the submissive is willing to serve can be negotiated. Like I said, if a Dom breaks the submissive's hard limits, the scene would end, and in a lot of cases, that breach of a relationship trust, the whole entire relationship could end. So when in a dominant submissive relationship, unlike slavery, if the slaveholder breaks the slave's limits, well, there is no really limits, but if the slaveholder can do almost anything to the slave, and the submissive in with outside of limits, and just really just can totally violate the person. And within a dom sub relationship, the submissive has hard limits, and if they're violated, it's definitely a breach of trust, and the relationship could end. The person could walk away and may walk away. The Dom may be permitted to break what are called soft limits. And these are things the submissive says they're not really interested in, but after discussing it with the submissive, they obtain their permission to do them. And so they're things that are like, they're not my favorite things to do, but if they please you, I may do them just with you. Um, it's still an area of consent, but it's somewhat of a negotiated consent. That's what soft limits are. It's like, hey, I know you really don't like anal sex, but I really do. Would you be interested in having anal sex with me? And then the person says, it's not my favorite, but I really like that it pleases you. And if we use enough lube and we do it right, and you take really good care and consideration of how my body feels, and go slow, we can do it together. That would be a breaking a soft limit, where the person would normally not have anal sex and wouldn't have it with anyone else because they trust their dominant partner. Under certain conditions, they may enjoy it with that dominant partner, or allow that dominant partner to enjoy that action with them. In most cases, submissives cross back and forth between retaining and surrendering control over some aspect of their lives. They continue to make decisions in the areas that are off limits for their dom. Um, they have, lots of, it is a limited power exchange, and they retain the power, and they go back and forth between the areas that they retain power in and the areas that they've surrendered power, and they kind of dance back and forth between that in their lives. A submissive resubmits to the dom at the start of any scene or activity over which the dom has negotiated authority. It just this doesn't mean that the person has to continuously earn their submission, because they've earned their trust. They've been vetted, and they have earned their trust. But in one sense, the submissive always makes that, whether consciously or unconsciously, makes that choice and has the choice to do any scene and activity. They the submissive really, they retain that personal choice. And so those are ways that sometimes people see just a submissive in a dominant submissive relationship as, as outside, people from the outside looking in may not understand what it means to be a submissive. They may see somebody as like a doormat or something, and that's not what it is. A submissive has lots of power, and they surrender part of that power, but they retain some of that power. They always have personal choice. They always have consent. They have limits that are respected, and they they can consensually choose what they do and don't want to do within a BDSM DNS relationship, Dom sub relationship. So now let's just kind of look at a slave. What is a slave within BDSM, and how does that differ from a slave from modern slavery outside of BDSM, the unethical kind, the kind that is a situation where a person oftentimes demands payment or a repayment of a loan they can't pay back, or any kind of work or services that are not done voluntarily, under the threat of some form of punishment, or deceptively recruited and kept through coercion, sometimes put in situations of exploitation. Those different types of things that you see, what we see within modern slavery, that makes it unethical, bad for the people involved. Exploitation is never good. People's personal rights, either they have no rights, or their rights are not respected. And so, what are some ways that BDSM slavery is both consensual and ethical? Let's look at that. So let me look at the definition here for you. This is the definition of a slave according to BDSM. It's a person who has transferred authority over him or herself to another. In a general sense, the distinction between a submissive and a slave focuses on whether the person retains any personal authority and or retains any meaningful decision-making capabilities, or surrender such authority to someone else. Also, play rules are usually different for slaves, as they lack the authority to tell their master to stop a scene. This is like the definition of a slave. So it's a person who has consensually transferred authority. Note, I don't personally call a master-slave relationship within BDSM. Some people call it a total power exchange, although that's kind of a misnomer, because in almost every case, nothing is total. Someone will, for instance, they'll still choose when they will and won't use the restroom. They won't ask permission every single time, or they won't wait for a master to come tell them when their body should use the restroom or should expel waste or fluid. And so, if it was total power exchange, people wouldn't even make the simplest of decisions. So, because total would mean total, I would believe. But so I don't like to use that terminology, even though it's popular. You find a lot of BDSM resources that use that. It can be somewhat confusing. And so I generally like to call say there's three different types of relationships. There is a power neutral, which would be like a top and bottom, people that just seen that they retain that, but both persons retain personal autonomy. I would say there is a power exchange relationship, which we just described as dominant and submissive relationship. And then I would say there is either an authority transfer. I like to call it an authority exchange relationship. That's what a master slave relationship is, because it's less about power and more about exchanging authority. A slave transfers their authority over him or herself to another, and they fall under like the umbrella of a master or mistress. And so a slave falls under their umbrella. It is usually marked by macro management instead of micromanagement, wherein the slave just generally, in a general sense, knows, while they may have specific rules and protocols, they know in a general sense how to please, or the things that please the master or mistress. And so let's look at some typical characteristics of a consensual slave's role within BDSM. So it's called an MS relationship, master slash slave. An MS relationship is based on authority transfer. This means that once the person who has become a slave has, in fact, surrendered personal authority over him or herself to the master owner, and they no longer have the personal power to make decisions for him or herself. Thus, a slave would not have authority to enter into, for instance, a DS scene with someone other than their master, without that master specifically transferring their authority over their own slave to another person. And so that's just one thing here. And so they generally, unlike human trafficking, a master's not going to give his slave to another person. It's unless those things were negotiated before they entered into an MS relationship. So, at least in theory, the slave gives up all rights to make personal decisions and becomes the property of the master. And of course, this is consensual. This is something that someone wants to do. And the core values are service and obedience. The slave loses the right to say no to master, and in its place, the slave may say, "Sir, if it pleases you," or "Master, I would really rather not," or "Sir, only if it pleases you." A slave cannot red out, meaning stop the scene, using a safe word often. Slaves have accepted their master's limits and does what's asked of them regardless of their feelings. Generally, within the negotiation time, the time preceding, which is often months or years, somebody entering this type of consensual slave relationship, master slave relationship, the master also learns the potential slave's boundaries and limits, and knows that they don't like anal sex, and that it would be a soft limit, or knows that they're scared of spiders, and so they wouldn't bring spiders into the bedroom, for instance. That's kind of an extreme thing, kind of a little bit of hyperbole there, but they're not going to bring spiders around the person. They're just not going to do it because they care for and this person who is consensually coming under the umbrella of their authority. Commonly in these types of relationships, these consensual BDSM relationships, a slave will have no rights to personal property, and and sometimes will continue to work for the benefit of the master's household. A slave's purpose is to make master's life easier. In that regard, a slave is expected to know master's wants and likes to the extent that the slave can take independent action on the master's behalf, like a proactive rather than a reactive, um, taking the initiative, knowing the things that a master wants. An active willfulness can terminate a relationship. This is particularly true in cases where a slave removes their own collar or, says, makes a direct no. Um, and this is, um, a MS relationship retains uh, its consensual nature. Um, there is nothing that can, ultimately they are a slave in a master slave relationship is there consensually and can choose at any time to remove the collar and walk away. They're not forced. There's no one who is being forced to be in that relationship model. And ultimately, just like a power exchange, an authority exchange is also ultimately a relationship. And so, in the same way, and even more so, there are lots of vetting goes into potential partners on both sides of the slash. A slave should definitely, or a potential slave should definitely vet a potential master, and vice versa. A potential master should definitely vet a potential slave in a BDSM relationship. And there should be lots of negotiation. That is, lots of talks, many, and very in-depth talks, negotiation. And there should be a contract. There should be lots of agreement, like major agreements, and things should definitely be worked through for a long period of time to find out if the two persons that the two potential persons are even compatible to be in this type of relationship. Perhaps instead of a master slave relationship, they should be in a dominant submissive relationship and have some limits. Perhaps both persons are not capable of being involved in um, this type of authority exchange. So maybe a limited power exchange would be better suited to the potential persons involved. So, oftentimes there is a service that they may be more interested in taking care of others than in being taken care of. A service heart. A lot of times, a slave will have a service heart. They may very well be dominant in other aspects of their life, but they've chosen to be submissive or simply to serve one single person. And so now that we've gone over some of those terms, we should definitely, hopefully you have a better understanding of the fact that BDSM slave relationships, they're not. No one is coerced, or at least they shouldn't be. No one is coerced. No one is recruited deceptively. There's lots of vetting, lots of negotiations, which are discussions, there is a contract, something that is, these people, that are working towards this type of relationship, they are negotiating, and then they come to an agreement. They learn each other's limits and boundaries. They learn about one another, and they take months, years, oftentimes, and most of the time, years. They take years to come to agreements and to consider each other and to learn each other and learn what each other likes, dislikes, and then especially the potential slave, to learn the master's likes and learn what pleases the master, that they are looking to consensually put themselves under the umbrella of their authority. And so there's no deceptive recruitment, there's no coercion. They're put under consideration. There's also no exploitation. Everything is written within a contract, so nobody gets exploited. The person who is a slave isn't like a slug. They're not just exploiting uh, the generosity of a benefactor. It's not a sugar daddy relationship. And it's not a sugar daddy slave relationship. They're not just there to, feed on the generosity of someone else. And on the other time, the other side of the situation, that the other person isn't being exploited. They're not just getting a sexual slave that they can just use and abuse and, um, you know, give to their friends and, loan out and give away and all of that sort of thing. It's not, nobody's being exploited. Nobody's being forced into any work or services. People are who enter into a BDSM relationships do so voluntarily. There's no threats being made to keep somebody. They can remove a collar, even though they most likely they put an investment of years into it. Only under the most extreme circumstances, maybe the person has changed over time or something. But even under the most you know extreme circumstances, the person can remove a collar and can walk away from that relationship. They can there are generally written into the contract how the contract is voided if the person chooses to. And so both people are there voluntarily. Nobody is making threats. There may be punishments involved, but they are negotiated and known about. Um, for um, they are written within the contract, and um, they are punishments for behaviors or whatnot. That if someone willingly does what they know the master doesn't allow. So there nobody is being demanded to repay any kind of debt or loan that they can. They're not put into that kind of it's not that kind of relationship. A BDSM relationship isn't somebody people don't enter into those to try to repay debts or loans. And then the person who exercises power or ownership over another person, ultimately it's consensual, it's voluntary, and it is done so, like I said, with consent. And ultimately, the person can walk away if they choose to. No one is going to keep anyone. Both parties are there because they want to be there. Both parties are the slave serves the master, but the master serves the relationship. And so both are creatures of service. They are both caring for and in a relationship with one another. And it is a relationship that is oftentimes spiritual, and oftentimes it just works. It is built upon BDSM history. We've had MS relationships to one degree or another all throughout the history of BDSM, and so they are timeless, and they are time tested, and they really work. And so the ultimate question, as I end this podcast, went a little longer than I generally do, is BDSM or consensual slavery, is it ethical? Yeah, it is ethical. It is ethical in that it is all BDSM is BDSM is always or consent is always a hallmark of BDSM. Consent and communication, consistency, trust. These are all hallmarks of BDSM. And so it is unlike other forms of non consensual, involuntary slavery. Yeah. BDSM relationships and BDSM slavery or MS relationships are nothing like the slavery that we've seen in the past, we see out in the world, where people are being exploited and used. So I hope that helps kind of separate the two. I am Primal Piggy. You can find me on Facebook at the Primal Piggy, and you can find our educational page on Facebook, Whips, Chains, and Duct Tape, at WCDTBDSM. Thank you for listening today. Have a good day.